Welcome back to the podcast where we celebrate innovation for a happy planet. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. Before I go any further, I'd like to take a pause and thank you, the listener, as well as our sponsors, as this is our 50th podcast, and that's something to be proud of. 50. In the next 3 podcasts, we will meet the winning entrepreneurs from Sustainable Ocean Alliance's Ocean Pitch Challenge that takes place annually in Paris, France. I am lucky to be on the pre-selection committee for this competition, where we whittle down over 200 companies from around the world to 10 finalists, from which these 3 winners are finally picked. Today's guest, Benjamin Alva, came in 3rd place with his Brooklyn-based company Azul Bio, which aims to improve the health of coral reefs and thus the ocean with their microbiome boosters. Basically, probiotics for the ocean. But let's hear it from Benjamin. Welcome to the podcast, Benjamin.
Thank you for having me.
So you have a startup called Azul Bio, and you recently placed in the Ocean Pitch contest that is organized by the Sustainable Ocean Alliance. What is the problem that Azul Bio is trying to solve?
Yeah, so we are addressing the existential threat of coral reef extinction. They provide direct support for 25% of all ocean life and income and nourishment for 1 billion humans on the planet. So they're extremely critical natural asset. But 50% have already died and 90% will be wiped out over the next 20 years, mainly due to ocean warming.
So what is causing this die-out? We hear about coral bleaching and things like that. Is this part of the problem that you're talking about?
Exactly. So coral bleaching is usually a symptom of some type of shock. The majority of cases is associated with the ocean warming, right? Like heat shock, temperature increase. And as climate change progresses and accelerates in its intensity, these bleaching events are occurring at a much more frequent rate. So, once in a 100-year event is now once every 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, 100-year storms are happening like every 6 months, it seems. So you mentioned, I think it's pretty easy for people to get their head around why the disruption of these coral reefs would be so impactful to the ocean, but you mentioned the human implication. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
In terms of the decline of coral reefs, of course, you're going to see huge losses in biodiversity. They are the cornerstone organism of the ocean, right? Again, supporting that quarter of all ocean life. But in terms of humans, 1 billion to 3 billion people, depending on how you estimate this figure, rely on coral reefs for income and nourishment. So basically having their livelihoods be based off of it, the majority of their protein source coming from the fish stocks that use the reefs as their natural habitat, mostly in tropical countries, right, where these coral reefs reside. But in addition to those threats, there's also the loss of coastal protection. So coral reefs are breaking waves and dissipating 97% of a lot of that wave energy before it hits the coastline. So they're massive biological storm breakers that are protecting a lot of these very expensive properties and other real estate that are in these tropical countries. So when those are gone, the thousands of years of protection that it provided will be wiped out. For good, it'll be really hard to get that back, and it will take decades to restore it if it's even possible. So it's incredibly important that we preserve that now, because other solutions like building concrete walls to break the waves, they provide very little support for biodiversity, right? They're kind of purely to protect against that coastline. But again, a concrete wall doesn't also, it doesn't it doesn't regenerate, unlike coral. So if the environment is healthy and stable, coral will continually build up and repair itself organically. So what is your approach? How are you going to help restore these coral reefs? At Azul Bio, we are creating what we call coral microbiome boosters. So these are isolated bacteria from resilient coral that then can be uploaded or installed into the rest of the coral reef, who is susceptible, right, to threats like ocean warming. And that will increase their own heat tolerance and be able to survive these, say, reoccurring heat waves that are wiping out coral, causing bleaching and then subsequent coral mortality.
Right. So let's get into this a little bit, the details, because when a coral reef bleaches, the skeleton is still there. So there's a structure for you to work with. Is that accurate?
Well, when if the coral is bleached, that means it could still be alive. In most cases, it is alive, right, for a short amount of time. But if there's a prolonged stress event where it's warm for a very long period, say, a week, couple weeks, it becomes, there's a greater probability of that coral dying off because it starves to death, right? Because it requires the microalgae that's symbiotic with the coral that gives it its color, right? It gets expelled, and these symbiotic algae were producing the majority of their food source in a lot of cases. So, yeah, and also just the event itself is very stressful to the tissue, right? To the coral organism, causing damage and stress directly.
Yep. So with your microbiome boosters, the coral can really actually regrow.
Yeah, so the microbiome boosters are, you could say, like the only proactive approach, right? There is coral restoration where you have, say, instead of manually outplanting coral one by one, trying to restore what was previously there, this approach is to increase the resiliency of the millions of hectares of coral that currently exist in the wild, so increasing their ability to survive. So this would, of course, protect them from damage, from death associated with heat-induced bleaching, but also cause them to be overall healthier and increasing reproductive rates and seeing that coral population expand, hopefully, over the coming years in a treated area versus decline, right, due to those mass bleaching events.
So there's a specific window in which you want to be able to address this. It sounds like it's either a healthy coral could benefit from it because you could help it grow faster and accelerate, and that would have net benefits, or maybe a bleached but not yet deceased coral where it needs some help to get back up and running.
Exactly. Preferentially, you apply this right before the season starts of bleaching, right before the summer months, and it can remain healthy and stable through that period. But also, it could be used as an emergency measure, right, where the coral is already stressed, and you apply this as a treatment to then ensure that the coral survives during that period and also recovers, because the two outcomes of this treatment is, one, increased heat tolerance, just objectively, so reducing the bleaching or mitigating it completely during temperature events, right? It depends on how hot it gets, right? If it gets very hot, then it might be hard to completely defend against it. But the second outcome is recovery, right, of the majority of the treated coral. So when there's a large bleaching event, most coral die from that. But what results have shown, with this treatment is that the corals will bounce back and recover even after a long period of heat stress.
Listeners are going to hear the word microbiome and we're going to think about our guts. It's a similar philosophy, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. It's the corals, you could say, kind of gut microbiota, right? So it's just how humans, a lot of how we digest food, how we process it, even communication with the brain, the gut-brain axis, where there's just so much that the gut controls and the microbiota that are in that. And this is the same for the coral, but way more important. So the coral itself is more of a superorganism, right? It's not just the coral, it's the coral with a huge array of symbiotic microalgae, bacteria, other types of microbial organisms. So it is like one of the most complex and most, say, interdependent organism on the planet, where it relies so much off of its microbiome that lives in symbiosis with it.
How would you figure out what is the right microbiome consistency, and how would you get it to the coral, because it's a wild world down there with a lot of moving parts?
Yeah, so in terms of initial development, we are aiming to have one very effective treatment that can span several different species. And this would be for a particular coral reef macro region. So you can think of that as, say, there's one particular formulation for the Florida Keys or the Mesoamerican reef or the Maldives. And this will be, we have a formula sheet for what microbes we want to include in there. But yes, we go out to those regions, sample coral, and then we identify which of the bacteria we want to find, those bacteria or bacteria with interchangeable functionality. And then put that into and create that formulation that we can just repeat in every single region, but with native microbiota, which is, it gets around, it kind of accelerates our ability to then scale those treatments in those countries, in those regions, right? And also potentially increasing efficacy as well using those native microbiota, and also reducing any risk, right, of cross-contamination between different regions. Yeah, in terms of getting it out there to the field, how do you apply it in the ocean? So we embed these beneficial bacteria, the CMB, in a hydrogel material that we turn into particles. So there's these particles of hydrogel that have the bacteria inside of them that can then be sprayed on coral underwater, just like a farmer on land would spray fertilizer on crops, kind of spot spraying, dozens of crops, per minute. So you can spray the particles on. It has a property where it adheres to the coral surface, and then it biodegrades over 1 to 2 weeks, slowly releasing the CMB bacteria at the surface of the coral and maximizing the treatment's efficacy.
And presumably, because the coral is establishing this ecosystem that all of those other critters around appreciate and are gravitate towards, that would be a welcoming environment for them too. So if a fish got some of the CMB attached to it, this wouldn't have a deleterious outcome.
Yeah, in terms of what off-target effects would be potentially. So in terms of off-target effects, it would be very minimal. And just for reference, our first field pilots are lined up to occur at the end of this year, so Q4 of 2024. Right, so this will be huge. One of the first companies to actually ever conduct environmental bioengineering to combat climate change, which will be, for us, it will be quite a milestone. But also, it will showcase, and we'll get a huge amount of useful data and generate a ton of useful data, and that will unlock a lot of doors for us working with a number of other groups in different countries. But there is one academic lab who actually did the first field test of a coral microbiome booster. And this is from KAUST. So they created a very localized formulation, and this is in a lab at KAUST that has been working on the solution for years, if not nearly a decade. Really the pioneers and a lot of early work still progressing now can be contributed to them. But they have tested this. The first paper was published at the beginning of this year, and it showcased that there was no off-target effect. So they analyzed the microbiome composition in the coral, of course, that were treated, the benthic, so kind of the soil underwater, as well as the water column. And there was no signs of the CMB within those areas. So basically, it does not really, it needs the coral to live symbiotically. So that's very much tied, right, to staying on that coral. But also this is, material, these are bacteria that are already, say, native or are already in the water column in the water column to some extent. And there's also a ton of competition. So when they're outside of that symbiotic protection the coral provides, there's so many other microbes that are competing with each other that they typically dissipate after a very short amount of time.
You mentioned earlier, another strategy might be people are trying to plant coral reefs. Is that a symbiotic relationship for you, and your company? Is that something? Would it be useful to plant these in those soon to be planted baby corals?
Exactly. So yeah, we don't view other coral restoration organizations as our competitor. They really are a collaborator or partner. Where the treatment can be applied to coral being outplanted, and then those coral will have that increased resiliency. So basically like a vaccine booster, you could think of it like that, where then it goes out in the wild and is immune to these effects. Yeah, but in addition to them using the CMB treatments, our business model at Azul Bio is based around what you can call a light touch service, where we are planning to centrally produce CMBs at a large scale and then coordinate and sell those treatment services around the world in those key regional coral reef markets. And then we will, or have partnered with a number of regional coral restoration groups, which are either NGOs, nonprofits, for-profit coral restoration organizations who have authority to treat a large area of coast, right, to manipulate the coral reef ecosystem. Already have the permits. They've been working these areas for years, and these will be the groups who will actually then be applying and going out there and treating the locations that were paid for. And we have a revenue sharing policy with these groups as well. So expanding the working capacity of groups around the world, while also, providing this proactive coral reef protection in one. So I think this is really
amazing.
effective.
So do you have a sense of what the rate of acceleration is if you use this booster? How much faster can it grow if its microbiome is enhanced?
Yeah, so that's something that the jury's out on. We don't know explicitly. We need to collect sufficient data on what that looks like, both in the lab and in the field. What is the expanded growth rate of coral? And that's something that also is measured over the long term as well.
Right.
So exactly. So that's something that we're looking to precisely quantify, but
yeah. But we know it can help a sick coral reef get better.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's more. Yeah. It's about There's also various formulations of CMBs that can be developed with unique benefits. Selecting bacteria with unique benefits that they provide. So one can be more specialized for increasing the growth rate, say within a particular environment, or to increase the growth rate in a acidified local marine ecosystem. Just for example, on the west coast of the U.S. or even Hawaii, heat-induced coral bleaching is not a significant issue, but they are dealing with slowing coral growth rates due to the increasing acidification.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. I'd like to thank Gulf of Maine Research Institute and Bold Ocean Ventures for their support of Happy Planet Podcast. GMRI and Bold Ocean Ventures have partnered to create a mission-driven venture capital fund supporting the growth of innovative, sustainable, ocean-related businesses. Listeners may remember Patrick Breeding, who was on our show last year to talk about Marin Skincare and its clinically proven formula that uses glycoproteins from Maine lobsters to treat eczema and dry, damaged skin. This company has since become wildly successful with this lobster lotion, and Patrick is inviting listeners to a 20% discount on their products by using the coupon code HAPPYPLANET on their website, marinskincare.com. I use this product myself, and I highly recommend it. So can the CMB basically, it might in your gut, help you be more resilient towards a more acid environment, or a warmer environment? I mean, can you engineer it in that way, make the coral more resilient?
Yeah, that is the premise. Yeah. So the bacteria that are being introduced, they cause an array of changes. The most prominent is a change in transcription in the coral. So basically, the coral, in response to these bacteria colonizing their surface, it changes its own physiology. So it's expressing more. Yeah, changing. It's producing more stress factors, changing the composition of its lipid membrane to be more resilient, as well as the bacteria itself, breaking down reactive oxygen species, which is a symptom of heat, where they start occurring, and the reactive oxygen species causes tissue damage, and those microbial organisms can break them down. So there's a couple different attributes. In addition to that, they introduced microbial community, increases the cycling of nutrients, so that there's the coral itself and the zooxanthellae are getting more, say, metabolites, so they are healthier and more robust during these stressful events.
Yeah, interesting. So I've met a lot of companies in the ocean space, and a lot of people interested in the reefs, but this is really a first for me in this sort of microbiome application. How'd you get into this, and why are you interested in this problem?
Yeah, so my background is cellular and molecular bioengineering, focused on creating microbial communities that can, say, work with the environment to combat climate change, and that is on Earth, but also to expand human habitation in space environments using resources you could find on the Moon and Mars. So I've worked with NASA, academic groups, and other biotech startups as well. But for me, and this mission, all the way back in 2028, when the last mass bleaching event occurred, all these news, all media channels were coming out with a lot of articles, like CNN, et cetera, constantly about the event. And to me, it was very clear that traditional restoration techniques were not enough, to combat this existential crisis of ocean warming, which is due to this accelerating climate change. So coming from a bioengineering background, I thought there that I needed to apply my skills right as soon as possible. And this was truly an urgent issue. We don't need to, this isn't building an app where we, you could do that anytime, but this is to, provide a solution within the next 20 years before 90% of these coral populations are wiped out. So to create some type of method that could elevate the resiliency of the wild coral, right, that exists, because the rate of outplanting of coral is 0.00001% of what is being lost. So like the scale is like it's unimaginable that we would be able to restore the reefs with current technology, maybe in 100 years or something or long. But at that point, the corals will be more or less extinct. Yeah.
Right. So this allows us to do it a lot faster, because if you can treat the right.
It's more of a proactive approach, right? Like there's no solution to protect wild coral reef. They're of colonies that have existed for have been living for decades, right? Or new colonies as well. So this is a way to give them an immune booster that allows them to survive kind of these new conditions of the environment, which includes increasing hotter temperatures as well as a greater acidification and other threats that could exist as well.
So how are people reacting to this? Because you mentioned the partners who are going to be applying it, and you've got presumably you're speaking to people around the world. What is the reaction?
Like of the solution and what the potential is?
Yeah,
definitely. So from one angle, of course, it's a huge hope, right? I mean, there's very, very, very few people who wouldn't want to help this effort, right? To have this technology exist. So obviously, it's very hopeful, especially for people who are quite familiar with the coral field, right? But there is also a couple of different angles, right? So everybody wants to help, but then if you look at, say, certain groups in venture capital, this is a more riskier venture for sure, but the impact is dramatic, right? I mean, there's very few organizations who have such a direct impact, especially when we're dealing with increasing CO2 and the production of CO2 is definitely not going to stop, right? I mean, we've seen a dramatic increase, like a doubling of CO2 production since 2019 because of data centers, right? I mean, AI itself, which is all the VC investment, right, is going towards basically increasing CO2 production by a huge amount. And CO2 removal is still in such a nascent place when there's also there isn't a solid market for it in the US, right? And you can see, when there's players, I won't go too deep into that, but it's more, I would say it's much more important in the short term over the next 50 years or more to focus on adapting environments and ecosystems, whether you're doing built environments in cities or adapting wildlife, right? To be able to withstand these changes, because they're going to come regardless.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And so where are you in your business?
We basically founded the company last year, where we were focused on really getting our platform technology developed. So this is the workflow and systems to analyze microbial isolates from coral samples and select and rapidly identify those beneficial bacteria that we want to use in our CMB. And now we have a number of provisional patents from that, both in the pipeline as well as our delivery system for those hydrogel particles for delivering the CMB right to coral. But now we are focusing on what you could call coral clinical trials. So a lot of testing in the laboratory of this heat tolerance CMB, where we want to wrap up kind of a good part of it by the beginning of August, and then we'll still be expanding tests and testing different things. But then by that point, we'll be moving into field pilots at the end of the year, as I said. And those are commercial agreements as well. Some of them are still being worked out, so I won't expand on them like in full detail. But they're with one of them in particular is with one of the top multinational hotel chains, and we plan to partner with them to work at many of their locations around the world. So that's going to be a pretty huge kind of media announcement when that all goes through. And then by next year, we want to actually start full-on commercial treatments, right, with CMBs in the Caribbean, and then eventually get to Asia Pacific.
So I'm really interested in your first sort of sponsor / client being a hotel chain. What is their mission? Why do they want to restore? Are they worried about coastal resiliency, or is this to boost tourism because they do tours, around the coral reefs? What is their interest?
It comes from two big angles, at least how it began. So one is they want to preserve the coral reefs. A lot of these hotels are in very tropical places with lots of coral biodiversity, and the losses are real, right, of the coral and the greater, say, fish and other life that's dependent on them, right? So they want to protect that, but also because they're a tourism company, they want it to be a big, say, PR effort as well, right? They want to boost and their kind of image of sustainability and protection of marine biodiversity, especially this one brand within this hotel that we're working with, where they're really focused on the environmental aspect and preserving the ecosystem, and that's really important to kind of get in the door as well. But then the next step is then showcasing the tangible,
well, that's what I was just going to say.
Right, exactly. That it'll have these tangible, these effects. And a notable tool that we developed is a integrated modeling, where we combine both coral biodiversity, ocean temperature data, as well as, say, wave and shoreline protection data, where we showcase what is the tangible financial impacts of the loss of coral over the next couple of years and even decades. But we can do that at a really high resolution. So we can just look at like a single property and map the coral distribution and see what is the loss and how does CMBs prevent that, which no one else on the planet has currently developed a tool like that. It's all very high level, like what is the value of coral on like a national scale with all these different benefits, but it's not useful from a business context because this is a tool that we explicitly developed to push customer, basically showcasing and teaching customers this benefit, right, of the CMB treatment. And a lot of players, a lot of people, like governments, et cetera, know about the shoreline protection, but for some commercial groups, this is something that has to be brought to the table to educate them on that front.
Yeah. Well, I love that tangibility that, we're missing that with carbon credits. So many of these efforts that we're talking about now are pretty elusive. So it really helps when you have an opportunity to showcase, a real difference over time. And I think I think you're going to get more hotels on board and nature conservancies. I mean, and if the tech proves out, the world is your coral reef.
You have some like people who really aren't in ecotech space who have a hard for VCs explicitly, right? People who are just thinking about investments all the time. It's hard for them to kind of wrap their mind around the business model. But then there's a lot of people who do deal with, say, in climate tech primarily, right? Almost everybody in climate tech, where they see just the huge potential, right? And they obviously the impact, but also just that if it all works out in the field, right, in the environment, that there's there'll be an endless amount of customers, especially as time increases and as ocean these threats become increasingly worse.
Yeah. So you mentioned VCs. How do you finance something like this? Have you worked with grants? Did you fundraise? Are you fundraising?
So we have raised from a number of different types of investors. We could call a formation round and a pre-seed round. And this has gone into a lot of our technology development, or building out our team. And we'll have a proper, I guess to expand on the types of investments, those are from angel checks as well as from VC as well, and also a grant. Not actually a direct grant though yet. We're kind of starting a campaign of grant writing and applying kind of now, but with a grant writer bringing on the team, and a grant coordinator. So I'm building a whole kind of small team for that, but with awards that we've won. So we've been really successful at kind of winning competitions. But we are opening a formal seed round in August of this year. So that's going to be open to primarily VC, et cetera. And at that point, we'll complete a number of key milestones, including putting out some published data on our laboratory results, as well as announcing some of those commercial contracts that we have.
You were a top 3 placement in the SOA Challenge, Sustainable Ocean Alliance Challenge. How does that impact your company, or why do you enter a competition like that?
Being in that competition and winning it is really good from an awareness standpoint. So really opening up the audience, yes, to kind of the other side of the Atlantic, if they were unaware of us previously, and for a lot of other players within the ocean space and beyond to become aware of us. And this kind of is prepping us up, right, for that fundraising round that we'll. So that's the kind of the core strategy with competing in the challenge.
Well, it was a good competition. There were a lot of interesting companies, so good for you. And it sounds like it was well merited. So you're in Brooklyn. Tell me a little bit about your geography and about the startup scene in Brooklyn. I know there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of good, say, real estate for bioscience laboratories in Brooklyn. Yeah, a huge amount of things emerging from it. But we are, I would say, probably the only marine biotech company, right? So especially so involved with the ocean. Maybe there's some like water testing companies, right? But yeah, so we're definitely extremely unique for the city.
So just out of curiosity, because there are a lot of people, including the Billion Oyster Project, trying to create oyster reefs in the New York harbor. But I read recently an article that was saying they were really having some trouble sort of taking root and propagating. Is there ever a possibility that you would find a solution for different types of reefs, like oyster reefs or mussel beds that also have some of these properties that can also help with coastal resiliency?
Yeah, for different types of organisms, right, or different types of aquaculture beyond coral. Definitely. I mean, this is where our platform technology comes in play, where we have developed this experimental and computational pipeline where we can very rapidly identify functional microbes, particularly bacteria, that can be used as these treatments, as these boosters for health or to combat other diseases within other species such as fish or our mollusks, right? And this kind of ties in play with our, say, longer term vision for the organization, where in terms of exiting the company at some point in the future, our eyes are on groups such as probiotic multinationals, these large conglomerates that are in a lot of different spaces of producing, say, probiotics for humans, but also different probiotic solutions for agriculture as well, or aquaculture, right? So that's kind of one of our kind of acquisition pipelines that we're
very interesting. So, well, don't exit too soon because it sounds like a lot of fun in the short term. A lot of good road trips.
Yeah. This will be farther down the timeline. Yeah. We want to be at the point where we have a good global market reach and sustainable annual returning revenue before we would do that. Yeah. And of course, we want to make sure that the partner that would acquire us, assuming everything works out right on the treatment front for coral reefs, that they would continue to run the company as we would want, right? Because this is quite an impactful solution, right? You don't want in the wrong hands,
right? Yeah. I ask this of everybody who comes on the podcast, because we're all in this race against the trend here with climate. So, are you optimistic about the future and our ability to stay ahead of these changes?
I say I am optimistic. But I would say that I was a lot more optimistic initially starting kind of my entrepreneurial journey, you could say, my founder journey, where, getting into the space, seeing the level of climate tech investment was quite massive. But then, as time goes on, really truly kind of learning where a lot of these deal flows are going towards and types of solutions, and even like what is the effect of these solutions practically have on reversing climate change or CO2 emissions. I think there's a lot of kind of very inefficient, doing this in the space, funding it with venture capital and doing it in this for-profit way. It definitely works for a number of things, but there's inefficiency, right, in trying to combat these existential crises with, where it's sometimes difficult to form a really simple business model, right, around. And as I mentioned with the rise of just increasing computation, right, and computational needs, I mean, that producing a lot more CO2, and that's a trend that's just skyrocketing.
Terrifying.
So I would say, yeah, it is terrifying. It's not good. So I am, definitely very disappointed, with how the global market or countries are addressing this, handling it. But I think there's definitely hope, right? There's definitely ways that we can address, with innovations and solutions and founders, both. It doesn't have to be for profit. It can be, founders of nonprofits, right? NGOs that equally or maybe even more can address these issues head on. So yeah, so there's hope on that front. If good people can put their minds to it, that we can have solutions that can make it.
So do you have any advice for other climate entrepreneurs today?
Yeah. So of what I would advise climate entrepreneurs on is really getting a solid foundation in like running and scaling a company, like a business. Like that's sometimes like that can be lacking in, I think, a lot of founders right in the beginning. There's a lot of company failure, right? Of course, and that's sometimes, and if it's more of a technical company, right, it's due to the founders coming in with very minimal business experience and not knowing what are the kind of the levers to pull to both reach that investor founder fit to become investable, which is really important right in the early days, especially if you're trying to really scale quickly, but also the say that product market fit as well. So knowing how to tweak it and how to approach things that are really strategic and are most beneficial to growing a startup, and not running things like an academic lab for one, or right, because that's a totally different mindset and workflow. And then you have to adapt yourself with rapidly creating MVPs and getting something that just works out there, but then keep kind of reaching for that next phase. And you really gotta there's many I wouldn't necessarily say financially bootstrap yourself, but bootstrapping it in many different ways, right? This could be from so many different angles, right? From building your technology to fundraising to having a team. Like it's better to have a very small group of really devoted and full-time individuals than kind of a large team of part-time people. So there's all kinds of nuances to learn about running a startup and company that tech founders who want to build a solution that solves climate change need to know first before they kind of approach their solution.
There's a good vibe now in ocean tech. It's growing really fast. It's getting a lot of love from the media at the moment, and there's a lot of good people in it. So if you got to be in a space right now, I think this is a really fun and hopeful one to be in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's starting from very small. I think there's only room to grow right now. So we'll see where the ceiling is, right, of ocean tech, and see how fast it grows, right? Because even 5 years ago, there was it was almost non-existent. So it's just a very significant trajectory.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I think what you're doing is fascinating, and if it can help boost these coral reefs and create some coastal resiliency and more biodiversity, then the planet is definitely going to be happier for it.
Yes, yeah, I hope so too. It all works out for the sake of, for these ecosystems. We're in a very kind of pivotal point in time where we have to take action now, or else it'll be too late.
Well, on that note, thanks again.
Thank you.
To counter the deleterious effects on gut bacteria, doctors often recommend probiotics while treating you with a course of antibiotics. If warming water is stripping coral reefs of the bacteria they need to thrive, it makes sense that we would consider a similar approach. In any case, I hope it works. We need healthy oceans because remember, every other breath we take comes from oxygen produced in the ocean. Thank you once again for listening. Please follow Happy Planet wherever you tune in and leave us a rating and review. It really does help new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me, Abigail Carroll. I am also the executive producer. George Brandel Egloff created our theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetpodcast.com.